Okay, starting. Okay, so my project is on Little Red Riding Hood. It's being subverted into three characters. They're Red. She's a 17-year-old red-headed girl with her deceased parents. She lives with her grandmother. And then there's Daryl, a 56-year-old man with brown hair, and he's a man that she meets about, I don't know, a quarter of the way through. We start with the opening scene, a shot in New York where it ends up in front of this house, going into viewing the grandmother's house where they both live. The camera views grandmother and Red sitting in their chairs. They get up, hop in a car, go to school. At school, Red has a conversation with her friend Emily about how she is having bad grades in her class and she's mad at her teacher, and then she leaves school halfway through the day because she doesn't want to be at school anymore, and she goes to she's walking downtown. She's just walking downtown with her backpack and her books and papers in her arms on her way home, and she bumps into this man. His name is Daryl, and she drops all her books and papers, and he helps her pick them up and talks to her and kind of says, "Can I give you a ride anywhere?" And Red hesitates as she doesn't want to, go with him, and then he convinces her that it's not okay and he's not a big bad wolf, and that he's not going to hurt her or anything, not in a demanding way. And then, so he drives her home, back to grandmother's house, and in scene 4, their grandmother's house, she offers Daryl in to have something to eat. They get talking, grandmother gets introduced, they have some fresh bread that grandmother makes. Grandmother questions Red why she's home so early from school, and she explains that she was having kind of a bad day at school, and then so grandmother starts telling stories about her childhood and stuff, and there's this cabin on the outside of the city that Red's great-grandmother used to live, so that would have been her grandma's mother, and she used to live in this cabin on the outside of the woods, and she's always wanted to go there, and Daryl kind of sits around with them talking, till later on. He stays there pretty much the rest of the day, and then the camera exits kind of at the end of the day when they're mentioning that he was wanting to go on like a picnic or something tomorrow, and so they both decide to go with him just for fun, and they go out to the cabin. So they're traveling outside the city, over to the cabin. Grandmother's telling stories in the car of when she was a young girl and how she paid, for candy, and it was like 5 cents and stuff, and telling stories of her childhood. And then they go they're walking down the kind of dark lane in the forest, and they walk into the cabin, and they go into the cabin. Daryl decides he's going to go back to the car and grab his camera, and then the mood kind of changes of the story. He grabs some tools out of his car instead of a camera. He grabs a crowbar, rope, handcuffs, and a torch, and he goes in, ties them both up into a heap on the floor, and then he decides he's going to burn the cabin down. So he's seen leaving after he burns the cabin, and then Red and grandmother are able to get out. The next shot we see is when they're out of the cabin. When they're down the hill, they kind of get free. That was kind of a suspenseful moment. They start walking back, and then they see that Daryl had kind of wrecked his car off the road, and he was stumbling on the road ahead of them, and he's all bloody, and Red kind of gives out a squeak. He turns around, starts running towards them, Grandmother tells Red to run off. She hides behind a tree. Then Grandmother gets in kind of a fight with Daryl, and he tries to stab a knife at her, and she misses the knife and kicks the knife away when they're on the ground. And Red comes up, grabs a knife, able to get Grandma off of Daryl, stabs Daryl, and at this point he appears to be dead. They run off away down the road, and then the last shot we see is them walking off into the distance, and then the camera zooms down to view Daryl and his eyes open, and that's where it ends. So.
Okay, so what is the main message or moral of your story?
So it's, I think, kind of along the lines of, don't go away with strangers, and that young people can be vulnerable in the world when they're not experienced, and they can get into bad situations, such as Red did with Daryl. She fell into, he wanted to get her away, out, to kill her basically, or, ended up to be death, so it ended up backfiring on him, so.
How have you changed or subverted the main message of the original fairy tale?
So the original fairy tale was, Red Riding Hood, the little girl, goes out into the woods. She goes out into the woods to take stuff to Grandmother's house. The wolf stops her in her tracks, and the wolf, says, "Why don't you leave the path and pick some wildflowers?" So that's kind of, in my story, it's where Red is kind of living her life, and then she one day, meets this guy, and he says, "Oh, why don't you?" And they start, get to be friends, and then they kind of, she wanders off her, path of life by following him and starting to do things with him in between. And then in the original story, they are, they go to the grandmother's house, and then the wolf eats the grandmother, and then eats Red Riding Hood. But in this one, the wolf tries, Daryl, instead of trying to eat them, obviously he tries to kill them. And in my story, it ended up backfiring, they escaped, and ended up killing Daryl themselves.
Who is your target audience?
The target audience, I think it's more like younger people, because if they, kind of read, probably like younger teenagers, because if they read this, they'll be able to hopefully make better decisions.
Tell me about your chosen settings. What modes or design elements would you have used for your mood?
So I used a lot of camera angles. There was quite a variety in camera angles to, change what, if you're looking down or up on something. And then we have the music, which quite often through, you can see it's like orchestral music or classical music. It's all depending to change the mood.
Whose point of view is the story told from?
The story is told from, well, I guess it's not really told from any, because it's told from, I guess, third person, because it talks about them saying things. It's not first person, it's not second person, it's a third person having the lines there.
Who has the position of power in your story, and how did you use this?
The position of power really was in Red's hands, because she had chose to follow Daryl in the beginning, and then I guess Daryl did have the power, but ultimately it was Red that had the power, because she made the ultimate decision whether to go with him or not.